Have you ever wondered why there are periods in life that seem as though everything is falling into chaos? Yet years later, when you look back, you realize that those very things quietly led you exactly where you needed to be. Why can a closed door leave you devastated in the moment, only to later become the reason you escaped a path that was never meant for you? And why does life sometimes have to become confusing before it begins to make sense? From Carl Jung's perspective, human beings do not live only through what is happening before their eyes, but also through the way the soul quietly arranges, reflects, and guides us through deeper layers of ourselves. What we call chaos is sometimes only an order that has not yet revealed itself. What we call delay is sometimes only a period of preparation that consciousness cannot yet fully understand. In today's video, we are going to enter a Jungian journey to understand why, in the end, everything will be okay, not through shallow reassurance, but by looking deeply into the empty spaces, the signs, the delays, the rejected parts, and the turning points that only become clear when we turn around and look back. Are you ready to step into this journey and discover why the very things that once made you feel lost may actually be the things quietly guiding you all along? Number 1. Why does everything suddenly feel empty? There is something very strange about the periods that confuse people the most in life. They often do not begin with an event large enough for you to immediately realize that everything is changing. Quite the opposite. They appear during days so ordinary they become frightening, in mornings that still unfold according to familiar routines, in conversations still filled with laughter, in schedules that seem no different at all. They create the feeling that the outside world is still functioning exactly as it always has, yet somehow, your experience of that very world begins changing, little by little. What makes this state so difficult to name is that it does not resemble sadness in the way people usually understand it. Because when we are sad, at least we know what has been lost. When we are disappointed, we can still point to a specific cause. When our hearts are broken, we still know who has left our lives. But there are completely different moments in which what appears is not clear pain or obvious loss, but a vague feeling that the things that once made you feel connected to life have suddenly become strangely distant in a way that cannot be explained. Perhaps you have experienced this before without realizing it. You wake up one morning just like thousands of mornings before. You make coffee the same way, check your phone, look at your to-do list, remember the goals you spent years pursuing. Yet, in the middle of all these familiar things, a very strange feeling begins slipping quietly into you, as if someone had silently removed from everything an invisible energy that you never even noticed had been there. Everything is still present, but whatever once made it feel alive somehow seems gone. And that very moment often brings with it a question that frightens many people, even though they rarely say it out loud. Am I breaking? Because when what once excited you no longer stirs your heart, when what once created meaning suddenly feels distant, when what once gave direction no longer provides certainty, the mind's first reaction is usually not curiosity, but panic. Human beings can endure pain for a very long time, but they are deeply afraid of not understanding what is happening inside themselves. There is an image that always makes me think of this state. Imagine a sailor who has spent many years at sea, someone who always navigated by the stars appearing in the night sky, someone who never doubted his direction because there was always something in the distance helping him know where he was. But then one night, the sea remains the same sea, the ship remains the same ship, and outwardly, nothing appears to have changed at all. Only the fog begins arriving, thicker, slower, more quietly, until he finally looks up and realizes he can no longer see the stars. And what frightens him is not the storm, because storms at least give people something to fight against. What becomes truly terrifying is the feeling of no longer knowing where to look in order to be certain that he is still moving in the right direction. Many people are living inside that exact moment without truly being able to name what they are experiencing, because from the outside, nothing has collapsed. Life continues operating in familiar ways. People still talk to you normally. Work continues. The world keeps moving. Everything seems to remain exactly where it belongs. Yet somewhere deep inside, a strange emptiness begins appearing. Not the emptiness of loss, but the emptiness of meaning, where the things that once made you feel connected to life gradually begin drifting farther away in ways that are difficult to explain. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved but only outgrown." Perhaps that is what makes periods like these so difficult, because many people search desperately for a clear answer to their confusion, while what appears does not resemble a problem that needs solving, but rather an experience that must be lived through. And perhaps this is also the part people rarely mention when they say that eventually everything will be okay. Because before human beings rediscover any sense of clarity, there is often a very uncertain period in which what frightens them most is not pain, failure, or losing something, but the moment they look at their own lives and quietly wonder whether something inside them is changing, or even more frightening, whether they are slowly losing the person they once were. If you have ever gone through a period where everything looked normal on the outside but inside there was an emptiness you could barely name, share your story in the comments below. Sometimes what makes us feel less alone is not finding an immediate answer, but realizing that there are others who have walked through the same feeling. Number 2, life suddenly begins filling with strange signs. And strangely enough, immediately after the period where everything inside begins becoming vague in this way, many people describe another experience that is even harder to explain. Because as the old sense of certainty slowly disappears, life around them seems to begin presenting very small things that leave behind a strange feeling that they are not entirely random in the way reason insists they are. You may have experienced this at some point in your life without truly paying attention to it. Perhaps you carried a question inside your mind for days without telling anyone, and then unexpectedly one morning you walk into a cafe, randomly open a book, overhear part of a conversation from a nearby table, or notice words appearing somewhere completely unexpected. What makes you stop is not the content itself, but a strange feeling arising immediately afterward. The feeling that this coincidence somehow touched something deeply personal inside you. The strange thing is that experiences like these rarely happen in ways dramatic enough for others to notice because they are small, ordinary, and easy to dismiss. A number repeating itself over many days. A name appearing in unrelated places. A phrase repeated by complete strangers. Or an image that seems meaningless but keeps returning so quietly that you begin wondering whether you are overthinking things or whether something else is truly happening. Carl Jung once said, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." Perhaps that is why Jung spent many years observing experiences most people quickly dismiss simply because they do not obey familiar logic. He did not see these phenomena as superstition, nor as proof of miracles, but as a completely different form of language, a language that does not speak with words, yet creates the feeling that something inside and outside are unexpectedly touching in the same moment. In Greek mythology, there is the story of Ariadne giving Theseus a thread before he entered the labyrinth to face the Minotaur. What is interesting is that the thread did not fight for him, explain anything, or reveal the final outcome. It simply existed as a small sign within the confusion of the labyrinth, so that when everything became most confusing, Theseus still had something to recognize and remember. Perhaps strange experiences in life sometimes appear in exactly that way, not to lead you somewhere, not to give complete answers, but simply to appear as a small sign that unexpectedly makes you pause. I once heard a friend say that during a period of feeling deeply confused about life, he continuously asked himself one question without sharing it with anyone. Am I moving in the wrong direction? Then, one very ordinary day, while stepping into a bookstore simply to avoid the rain, he absent-mindedly pulled a random book from the shelf, and the first words he saw were, "Not all those who wander are lost." What stayed with him was not the sentence itself, but the strange feeling appearing during the seconds afterward, as though something deep inside him had suddenly been touched. Imagine standing in a completely dark room and seeing tiny lights flicker briefly at the far end of a hallway. They are not bright enough to illuminate the entire space, nor large enough to immediately change anything. Yet their appearance makes it impossible to completely ignore them, because no matter how small they are, they still create the feeling that something is present within the darkness. Perhaps what makes these experiences unforgettable is not the event itself, but the strange feeling appearing in that moment. The feeling that some part of you recognized something before your mind understood it. Because there are moments that become more distant the harder you analyze them. But the moment you stop trying to explain everything logically, you unexpectedly realize that some things in life do not come to give immediate answers. They quietly appear only as reminders that perhaps everything is not as chaotic as you once believed. You begin feeling something very strange, because for the first time after a long period of seeing life as nothing more than a sequence of repeating events, you start realizing that very small things can suddenly make you pause longer than expected. And while reason may continue insisting that everything is merely coincidence, somewhere deeper inside, there remains a feeling that is difficult to explain. Sometimes, coincidences are not simply coincidences. Number 3. Why do you always feel like you are arriving too late? And what if those strange signs do not appear to answer your question, but instead only quietly make you begin asking another question that feels even more uncomfortable? Why do I always have the feeling that I am arriving later than my own life? There is a very quiet fear that many people rarely admit, because it is not as intense as failure, not as sharp as loss, yet it has the ability to stay attached to a person for many years without leaving. And that is the feeling of being left behind, while everyone else seems to be moving in rhythm with their own lives. You look around and begin seeing that the people who once walked beside you years ago have gotten married, built families, stabilized their careers, figured out what they want and where they are going, while you yourself still carry a feeling that is very difficult to name, that somehow you seem to be one step slower than life itself. What makes that feeling become so heavy lies in the fact that it does not arise from what is happening inside you, but comes from the moment you begin measuring your journey using someone else's clock. You see age as a milestone, see achievement as an invisible ranking board, see time as a silent race in which everyone else seems to have known the rules for a very long time, while you are still trying to understand what exactly is happening. And then, over time, a question begins appearing more and more frequently inside your mind. Am I moving too slowly? During a Jungian therapy session, I heard the story of a woman named Linda, who turned 36 with a feeling that was very difficult to describe, because at a point when the friends around her already had families, stable careers, and clear plans for the future, she was still constantly changing jobs, still did not know what truly made her feel she belonged, and still carried a feeling of being lost that she thought she should have overcome a long time ago. What hurt her most was not that her life was terrible, but that every time she opened social media, every time she attended a class reunion, or every time she heard someone ask the familiar question, "How are things these days?" she felt as if an invisible clock was quietly reminding her that everyone else seemed to have gone much farther ahead, while she herself was still standing somewhere in the middle of the journey without being able to clearly name exactly where she was going. And the interesting thing is that modern psychology truly shows that the human brain is created to continuously compare its own position with other people. Many studies on social comparison theory indicate that people often evaluate their value not based on absolute reality, but based on their relative position within a reference group. In other words, the brain does not only ask, "Where am I?" but continuously asks, "Where am I compared to the people around me?" And perhaps that is why the feeling of being left behind often appears even when your life is not actually collapsing at all. Carl Jung once wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order." Perhaps Jung understood very clearly something that many people often forget, which is that human beings tend to see time as a straight line, where everything must happen in the correct order, at the correct speed, and at the correct moment, while inner life seems not to operate in that way. Ancient Greeks once used two different words to speak about time. They called chronos the time of clocks, calendars, age, milestones, and measurement. But they also had another word, kairos, a form of time that is not measured by minutes or years, but by the right moment, by the point at which something is truly ready to appear. And perhaps most of human suffering lies in the fact that we live according to chronos, while the soul operates according to kairos. Because sometimes what makes you suffer is not that you are truly moving in the wrong direction, but that you continuously look over into someone else's lane and conclude that you are moving too slowly. You see someone building a career at 25 and forget that someone else finds the right work at 40. You see someone becoming stable very early and forget that some lives need to go through many more crossroads before understanding where they truly belong. And this is also the part that very few people mention when they say that eventually everything will be okay. Because before human beings learn how to trust their own journey, they often must go through a very quiet battle with time, where what exhausts them is not that life is fighting against them, but the feeling that they are constantly arriving late in a race that perhaps, from the very beginning, was never created for everyone to run at the same speed. If by this point you realize that you too have many times felt left behind simply because you were looking at life through someone else's clock, give this video a like. Perhaps that is also a way of reminding yourself that every journey has its own timing. And if by this point you realize that you too have many times felt left behind simply because you were looking at life through someone else's clock, give this video a like. Perhaps that is also a way of reminding yourself that every journey has its own timing. Number 4, what you hate most about yourself may be the place holding your greatest strength. If the feeling of arriving too late causes people to begin doubting their journey, then perhaps after a very long period of looking outward in order to compare, measure, and ask themselves why they are not like other people, there comes a moment when you begin turning back to face a question that is much more uncomfortable. What if the thing causing me the greatest pain was never time at all? Human beings often spend many years trying to build a version of themselves that is good enough to be accepted, right enough to be loved, and fitting enough not to be seen as different. But during that process, we also quietly learn how to push certain parts of ourselves out of sight, not because they disappear, but because they make us feel ashamed. Some people learn to hide their sensitivity because they were once told they were too weak. Some people learn to suppress intense emotions because they were once considered too complicated. Some people try to make their different thoughts smaller simply because they have become too familiar with the feeling of not belonging to the crowd. What is worth noticing is that those pushed away parts rarely disappear in the way we imagine. They do not leave who you are, they do not dissolve, and they do not stop existing simply because you decide not to look at them anymore, but instead they are like rooms that have been locked inside a very large house, where you gradually become accustomed to walking past without opening the doors, until one day you almost forget that something once existed behind those doors. Carl Jung once wrote, "I'd rather be whole than good. I would rather become whole than become a good person according to the meaning defined by other people." Perhaps that is also what makes Jung's thinking different from many familiar perspectives on self-development, because he was not overly concerned with people becoming more perfect, more positive, or easier to be loved, but rather he cared about the forgotten parts, the unlived parts, the parts quietly existing in darkness simply because they do not fit the image we want the world to see. And perhaps what makes people misunderstand themselves most easily lies in the fact that the qualities that make us feel ashamed rarely appear in the form of strength. They usually appear as being too sensitive, too intense, too different, or too emotional, making us very easily believe that they are things that need to be fixed as quickly as possible. While what is difficult to realize is that sometimes what makes you feel disconnected from the crowd may actually be a sign showing that you were never created to live like the majority from the very beginning. I once knew a man named Daniel, a person who throughout almost his entire life always felt uncomfortable with his own sensitivity. He was the kind of person who could notice very quickly small changes in other people's emotions, who could feel the atmosphere in a room changing from only a glance or a very brief silence. And for many years, He always thought that this was a weakness that made him become more exhausted than other people. While the friends around him seemed to move forward very easily after an argument or an unpleasant experience, Daniel often thought for a very long time, felt very deeply, and was affected by things that seemed very small. He hated that about himself to the point that he spent many years trying to become tougher, more rational and less emotional. But the strange thing was that the more he tried to eliminate that part, the more distant he felt from himself, because there are parts inside human beings that do not ask to be fixed. They only ask to be acknowledged, that they exist. And what Daniel failed to realize for many years was that the sensitivity he always viewed as a burden actually gave him the ability to listen to other people in a very rare way, allowing him to notice the things others missed and feel very subtle signals that not everyone could see. Imagine a person living for many years in a large house, but only using a few brightly lit rooms in the front, while the rooms at the end of the hallway always remain closed, because he believes that inside them are things that are unnecessary or shameful. Over time, he gradually forgets that they exist, until one day he accidentally opens an old door and realizes that behind it is not something frightening as he once imagined, but rather rooms filled with valuable objects that had been covered in dust for far too long. Perhaps what causes many people pain does not lie in the fact that they truly lack something, but lies in the fact that they spend too much time fighting against a part inside themselves simply because it does not resemble the image they think they should become. And perhaps this is also something very few people mention when they say that eventually everything will be okay. Because sometimes before people truly believe that their lives are moving in the right direction, they must face the possibility that the thing they have always tried to push far away may not necessarily be their weakest part, but may actually be the very place holding the most valuable qualities they never allowed themselves to live alongside. Number 5. What happens when the ego is no longer holding the wheel? And perhaps after a person begins realizing that the thing they have always tried to push far away may not necessarily be the weakest part of themselves, another movement, even quieter than before, begins appearing inside. Because when you have become too exhausted from constantly fixing yourself, constantly forcing yourself, and constantly trying to become someone else, there comes a very strange moment when you no longer have enough strength to continue controlling everything the way you once did. Most people live almost their entire lives with the belief that if they try hard enough, think carefully enough, and control tightly enough, they will avoid mistakes, avoid suffering, and keep life moving in the right direction. We make plans for the future, try to predict the reactions of others, try to manage emotions, try to control outcomes, and sometimes even try to control how we should feel. There is a very familiar voice that always exists inside each person and continuously whispers that if we think a little more, prepare a little more, or put in a little more effort, everything will eventually be okay. But what few people realize is that the ego, or what Jung called the ego, was never created to carry the entire weight of psychological life. It is like a very hard-working manager, very disciplined and very serious, but who gradually forgets that he is only one part of the system and not the whole system itself. And then there come periods in life when you begin feeling a very different kind of exhaustion. Not exactly physical burnout and not entirely emotional exhaustion either, but something more like the state of keeping your hands on the steering wheel of a car for far too long during a long journey, to the point that what exhausts you is no longer the road ahead, but the need to constantly tense yourself in order to maintain control. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Perhaps what Jung wanted to say was not that human beings need to gain more control, but quite the opposite. He was pointing toward a truth that is rather difficult to accept, that sometimes the thing exhausting us most is not life itself, but the endless effort to keep everything within the boundaries where the ego feels safe. There is a story about Jim Carrey, who once became one of the most famous and successful comedians in Hollywood, that has always felt very close to this state for me. For many years, He pursued success with an almost extreme intensity, continuously setting new goals, continuously running forward, and believing that if he could just achieve one more thing, one more milestone, one more successful version of himself, he would finally find the feeling of wholeness he had been searching for. But after achieving nearly everything other people dream of, he repeatedly spoke about a very strange feeling. A feeling as though he had spent too much time trying to become a character he believed he needed to be. What is interesting does not lie in his success, but in the moment when he stopped trying to tighten his grip on everything through sheer willpower, the way he once did. There is an image that always makes me think of this state. Imagine a man rowing a boat on a large river and spending many hours trying to pull the oars toward himself, using all his strength, because he believes that if he just tries a little harder, the boat will move in a more correct direction. But after many hours, his hands begin to ache, his shoulders begin to grow heavy, and his energy becomes nearly depleted, to the point that for the first time, he loosens his grip for a few seconds simply because he no longer has enough strength. And in that very moment, what surprises him is not that the boat stops moving, but realizing that the water had never stopped flowing. The interesting thing is that this state often does not arrive in the way people imagine. It does not resemble a dramatic awakening moment, nor a major decision that instantly changes everything, but instead usually appears very quietly through movements so small that you almost fail to notice them. When one day you suddenly no longer feel the urge to immediately fix everything, no longer feel the need to solve everything right now, and no longer tense yourself before every small crossroads the way you used to. It arrives very gently, very slowly, like the first time after many years that you stop arguing with the current flowing inside you. There are changes in inner life that are very difficult to recognize while they are happening. Before human beings truly feel any sense of quietness, there often appears a very strange stage where what changes is not the outside world, but the control center inside. The ego no longer tries to tightly hold everything as before, and for the first time in a very long while, you stop trying to become the person who must personally keep everything standing still. As though somewhere very deep inside, another part is quietly learning how to trust that perhaps in the end, everything can still be okay, even when you stop trying to control the entire journey. And if you have ever experienced the exhaustion of having to keep everything under control for too long, leave one word in the comments: let go. Perhaps sometimes the strongest thing is not tightening your grip harder, but stopping the effort to keep everything standing still. Number 6. The final moment, looking back and understanding everything. And perhaps after everything that has been gone through, from the emptinesses that could not be named, the signals that were difficult to explain, the feeling of arriving late, the rejected parts within oneself, all the way to the moment when the ego begins loosening its control, there comes a very strange point when human beings suddenly realize that the biggest question was never truly, why did this happen to me? But rather, if one day I turn around and look back, was everything really as chaotic as I once thought? And perhaps that is also where people begin moving closer to the deepest meaning of the statement that in the end everything will be okay. There is something very special about the way human beings experience life, and that is that while living in the middle of an event itself, we almost never can see its true shape. A closed door usually only creates a feeling of loss, a broken plan usually only brings disappointment, and a failure, while it is happening, often simply takes the form of failure. When standing directly at the center of a life event, the mind almost always wants to quickly conclude whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, a step forward or a step backward, but life seems very rarely to reveal its meaning at the exact moment it is happening. Interestingly, cognitive science also points to something very close to that experience. In psychology, there exists the concept of narrative identity theory, which suggests that human beings do not live only through isolated events, but continuously connect them into a meaningful story about themselves. The brain does not like disconnected fragments. It always tries to find a line connecting what has happened, and sometimes, only after enough time has passed, do people begin seeing the shape of the picture, that previously they stood too close to understand. A viewer of the channel shared that he spent nearly 5 years trying to pursue a career path that he firmly believed was the only path meant for him. He prepared everything, placed all of his hopes into it, and believed that if he did not achieve it, everything would collapse. But then he failed. That door closed completely in a way that could not be repaired. For a very long time, he saw that event only as the greatest mistake of his life. But many years later, when sitting and looking back, he realized that it was precisely because that door closed that he was forced to turn toward another direction, meet different people, and step into experiences that, if his original plan had succeeded, he would never have gone through. What surprised him was not that everything afterward became perfect, but the very strange feeling of realizing that the thing which caused him the greatest pain had actually been quietly redirecting his entire journey. The strangest thing about life lies in the fact that while an event is happening, it often looks like a period at the end of a sentence. But much later, when looking back from a great enough distance, you realize that what you once called an ending was sometimes only a comma placed in the wrong spot. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Jung understood that human beings often look at life only through separate moments, while inner life itself operates like a massive tapestry being woven from the backside. When standing too close, you only see tangled threads, colors out of place, broken sections, and knots that make no sense. Only when stepping far enough away do you begin realizing that the things that once looked meaningless are actually forming a larger picture. That is also why many people only truly understand a part of their lives when they turn around and look back, not because the past has changed, but because the distance has changed. What once looked like a dead end turns out to be a turn. What once looked like losing direction turns out to be redirection. And what once looked like an ending turns out to be only a connection point between two stretches of road that, while standing directly in the middle of it, you were completely unable to see what was waiting ahead. Perhaps this is also the closest thing to the true meaning of the phrase, "Why everything is gonna work out in the end," because it does not mean that everything always unfolds exactly according to your wishes. And it also does not mean that every life event will feel pleasant while it is happening. But perhaps it simply means this: there are tapestries that only reveal themselves when you turn around and look back. There are roads that only reveal the reason for their existence long after you have already traveled through them. And sometimes, what makes you believe that in the end, everything will be okay, is not because you can see the entire journey from the beginning, but because at some point you realize that the things which once seemed to be breaking your life apart may actually have been the very things quietly arranging it in ways that, while standing in the middle of the journey, you could never have seen. Perhaps after everything we have just gone through, the most important thing does not lie in whether life eventually becomes perfect or not, but in the moment you begin looking at your own journey with a different pair of eyes. Because many people spend years trying to find meaning in events while they are still unfolding, while perhaps life was never created to be fully understood immediately. And if there is something Carl Jung tried to remind us of throughout this entire journey, then perhaps it is this: what you are calling chaos today may not necessarily be a sign that you are moving down the wrong road. There are pauses that do not exist to end things. There are turns that do not exist to make you lost. And there are things that seem to take so much away from you, but are actually quietly bringing you closer to the place where you truly belong. If this video touched a very deep part inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear this right now. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you can continue joining us on the journey of exploring psychological depth, Carl Jung, and the mysteries hidden within the human soul. And perhaps one day, when you turn around and look back, you will realize that everything was never truly going in the wrong direction. It was only quietly bringing you to exactly where you needed to be.